In the autumn of 2013, a man named Silas Crenshaw sent an invoice for $52,174 to the corporate headquarters of Ridgeline Engineered Lumber. The envelope was cream-colored stock, thick enough that you'd have to special order it. The address on the front was written by hand in a steady architectural script. Inside, a single line item printed from an old dot matrix printer read, "Storage Sorting and Curation of Raw Materials, March 2001 to October 2013. The accounts payable clerk thought it was a prank. The new operations manager, a 36-year-old man named Reed Calloway, who had never once in his professional life been surprised by a number, laughed out loud. He shouldn't have. If you want to understand why, you have to understand the fence and the 12 years that came before it. If stories like this one stay with you, the quiet kind, the ones about people who wait when everyone else gives up, consider subscribing. There are more of them, and they're worth your time. The fence went up in the spring of 2001. 1,400 feet of galvanized chain link 4 feet high, installed in a single week by a crew of 8 men who ate their lunches in a white pickup truck and never once looked over their shoulder at the man watching them from the edge of his property. That man was Silas Crenshaw. He was 61 years old that spring, the kind of 61 that comes from decades of early mornings and physical work. His hands were large and rough at the knuckles, with a long white scar along the left index finger from a chisel that slipped when he was 19, the only serious mistake he ever made with an edge tool in the last. He had a deliberate way of moving, like a man who had learned long ago that rushing a thing almost always cost you more time than it saved. He was a cabinet maker, third generation. His grandfather Ezra had bought these 4.1 acres in 1924 for $680, a long, narrow parcel on the rural edge of Asheville, North Carolina, backed against the slow rise of the Blue Ridge foothills. His father Thomas had expanded the workshop in 1962, the year Silas was born. The shop smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, and faintly of the cedar shavings Thomas always kept in a clay bowl near the door because he liked the way they kept the air clean. Silas had worked in that shop since he was 7 years old. For 77 years, the western border of the Crenshaw land had been marked by nothing more formal than a row of dogwood trees and a thicket of wild blackberry that came back every summer, no matter how many times anyone cut it down. In late April, the dogwoods flowered white. In August, the blackberries were ripe. This was how the world had been arranged, and as far as Silas Crenshaw was concerned, it was a reasonable arrangement. Then the industrial park broke ground, and the chain link went in, and the white dogwood blossoms bloomed for the last spring against a hard geometric backdrop of galvanized steel. Silas did not complain about this. He was not by nature a complainer. He watched the fence go up with the same calm attention he brought to everything, the way he watched a piece of wood for the first faint sign of a warp, or watched a joint for the hairline gap that told you something hadn't seated properly. Information was information. A fence was a fence. What mattered was what came next. What came next was the factory. Ridgeline Engineered Lumber went up over the course of 14 months. 80,000 square feet of concrete tilt wall construction, climate-controlled drying rooms, a rail spur off the Norfolk Southern line, and a row of CNC saws that cost more than the entire Crenshaw land had been worth for most of the 20th century. They brought in Douglas fir from Oregon, southern yellow pine from Georgia, laminated veneer lumber from Quebec. Perfect material, kiln-dried to exacting moisture, specifications, fed into computer-controlled machines that cut it to tolerances of a 1/16 of an inch. Silas watched all of it from his side of the fence. He was a man who understood wood, understood it in the way that comes from a lifetime of working with it, from the smell of a freshly ripped board and the feel of a properly stickered stack, and the sound a plane makes when it's set exactly right, and the wood gives without complaint. He understood what it meant to take a piece of raw material and bring out what was already in it. What he did not understand, what offended him at a level deeper than thought, the way a wrong note offends a musician who has played the same piece for 40 years, was the yellow dumpster. It appeared in March of 2001, large enough to swallow a small car positioned near the factory's east loading dock. Every 2 days, a forklift would trundle out from the production floor, pushing a 4-cubic-yard steel bin heaped with wooden offcuts, and tip the contents into the dumpster. Then an industrial hauling truck would come and take it all to the county landfill. Silas watched this happen 7 times before he crossed the property line. The offcuts were not garbage. That was the thing. They were the fractional remainders of precision manufacturing, the 14-inch piece left over when a 24-foot beam was cut to 23 feet and 10 inches. The 8-inch scrap from a Douglas fir 2x10. The corner triangle from a sheet of Baltic birch plywood, its layers so tight and void-free you could have used it for a jewelry box. Each piece was kiln-dried, straight grain clean. Each piece had been purchased at premium lumber prices and then discarded because it was 6 inches too short for the next job. To the factory systems, they were process waste, a cost of disposal line item monthly. To Silas Crenshaw, they were like watching a man throw away a full box of nails because he only needed half of them. He walked over on a Tuesday morning in late March. The shift foreman, a man named Harlan Briggs, 57 years old, retired Army bad knee, from a jump gone wrong at Fort Bragg in 1989, was overseeing the dumping from the loading dock steps. Harlan Briggs had a face like a piece of reclaimed oak, weathered, marked by time, and substantially harder than it appeared. Silas walked up slowly. He did not rush. He stood near the dumpster and looked at a 3-foot length of clear Douglas fir that had landed on top of the pile. He looked at Harlan Briggs. "Can I take some of this for my wood stove?" Harlan Briggs looked at the old man, looked at the dumpster, looked at the manifest on his clipboard, which required him to account for the weight of material going to the landfill and the cost per ton. Looked back at the old man. "Take what you want. It's all going to the dump anyway. Just stay clear of the forklift." That was the agreement. Fewer than 20 words between two men of a particular generation who had grown up in a world where a handshake meant something and paperwork was what you did when you didn't trust the person you were shaking hands with. No contract, no lease, no liability waiver. The next morning, Harlan told his forklift operator to dump the offcut bin over the back fence instead of walking it to the main dumpster. It saved a trip. It saved a marginal amount of dumpster space. It solved a problem for the old man next door. Everyone benefited. Nobody wrote it down. And so the rhythm began. 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes more. During busy production runs, the forklift would rumble to the back corner of the factory lot, raise the steel bin, and tip a cascade of wooden pieces over the chain link. The sound of it, a clatter and boom like a brief controlled avalanche, became part of the texture of Silas Crenshaw's days. He learned to hear it from inside the workshop. He learned what kind of wood had arrived by the sound it made. Landing the heavy crack of thick fir beams, the lighter rattle of plywood scraps, the hollow knock of short maple blocks. He would finish what he was working on. Then he would pull on his father's leather gloves, the palms darkened to near black with 40 years of oil and sweat. The stitching along the left thumb replaced twice, and he would go to the fence. This is where the story stops being simple and starts being something else. From the county road, what accumulated along the western border of the Crenshaw property looked like a pile, a heap, a mess. It grew from a mound to a ridge over the first 2 years, and by the time it was fully established, it stretched nearly the entire length of the fence line, rising in places to 8 feet high, an irregular mass of timber and plywood that caught the eye and immediately suggested neglect, carelessness, a certain comfortable disorder that some people interpreted as poverty and others as eccentricity. Silas's daughter June drove down from Charlotte one weekend in the fall of 2002 and stood at the edge of it in her good coat, her arms crossed. "Dad, people are going to talk." "Let them." She came back the following spring, and it was larger. She did not say anything that time. She went inside and made coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the ridge of wood along the fence and decided not for the last time, and not for the last time wrongly, that this was a phase that it would run its course, that her father would eventually acknowledge the impracticality of the whole enterprise. June was a practical woman. She was a CPA in Charlotte, precise with numbers, efficient with time, and she loved her father with the specific exasperation of a child who has watched a parent do something incomprehensible for so long that the incomprehension has become its own kind of intimacy. She understood that her father was stubborn. What she did not yet understand, what almost no one understood, was that what looked like stubbornness from the outside was from the inside something closer to certainty. Silas never saw a pile. He saw an inventory. Every evening after he finished in the workshop, he went to the fence. He would spend an hour there, sometimes more, when the loads had been large. He wore the leather gloves and worked methodically, moving pieces from the raw heap to the sorting area he had established along the eastern edge of the property under the remaining dogwoods. He separated by species first the reddish cast of Douglas fir, the pale cream of hard maple, the open grain of the occasional white oak that appeared when the factory ran a custom millwork batch. Then by dimension 2x4s in one stack, 2x6s in another, the larger beams off to one side, the plywood sheets stacked flat on a pair of sawhorses he had positioned for exactly this purpose. Then by quality. This part took the longest. He examined each piece under a work light he had run on an extension cord from the shop. He was looking for knots that went all the way through, for splits along the grain, for the small diagonal checks that meant internal stress still working itself out. Anything structurally compromised went to the firewood row stacked neat and cross-hatched exactly 6 feet high and 6 feet long enough to last 2 winters. He never let it get smaller than that. The good wood, the clear-grained, properly dimensioned pieces that had been cut from prime stock and simply happened to be a foot too short, he treated differently. He stickered it. His grandfather Ezra had taught his father Thomas this technique, and Thomas had taught Silas when Silas was 10 years old, and complaining about why they couldn't just stack the wood flat like normal people. The answer, as Silas gave it decades later to his grandson West, with the same quiet certainty Thomas had given it to him, was that wood is not a finished thing. It is a living material that is still working, still adjusting, still finding its equilibrium between the moisture in itself and the moisture in the air around it. The kiln dries it, yes, but the kiln is a controlled environment, and the world is not controlled. To truly season wood to bring it to the stable, settled condition you need for furniture that won't crack at the joints or warp across the face, you need to let it breathe in the actual air where it will be used. You need time, you need patience, you need stickers. A sticker is nothing more than a small, uniformly sized piece of wood laid crossways between the courses of a stack to create a gap of about an inch. That inch of air moving through freely carries away moisture evenly. It lets the wood acclimate. It lets the wood rest. Silas's stickered stacks were hidden behind the chaotic face of the heap. They were geometric and careful oriented to catch the prevailing southwest wind that came down off the mountains in summer. Each stack had a small wooden tag at the end. Species, rough dimensions, date received, written in the same architectural hand his father had used and his father's father before that. In a small notebook he kept on the workbench inside, he recorded the estimated board footage of each load. He had a system for estimating quickly, a practiced eye trained by 4 decades of calculating yield. The numbers accumulated. 300 board feet in April, 400 in May. The factory had good months and slow months, but the loads never fully stopped. By the end of the first year, he had logged an estimated 4,000 board feet of prime kiln-dried lumber. A commercial supplier in Asheville would have charged at that time around $8,000 for the same quantity. Silas wrote the number down in the notebook, turned the page, and went back to work. His grandson West was 11 years old in the spring of 2001, a serious-faced boy who liked video games and was learning to be embarrassed by the things that distinguished his grandfather's property from the properties of his friends' grandparents. The pile, he called it the pile, or sometimes Grandpa's junk ridge, was high on the list. By the time he was 14, he referred to it without looking at it the way you stop looking at something. That has become a source of low-grade ongoing humiliation. One evening in the summer of 2004, Silas brought the boy out to the sorting area. Wes stood with his hands in his pockets the way teenagers stand when they want you to know that their presence is a concession. Silas handed him a piece of Douglas fir, 2 inches by 8 inches, 22 inches long. Clear-grained, reddish-brown, warm from sitting in the afternoon sun. "What do you see?" Wes looked at it the way you look at a thing when you already know the answer, and the answer is nothing interesting. "A piece of wood." Silas took it back, held it up at an angle to the light, sighting down its face the way a carpenter checks for flatness, a gesture so habitual it had become a part of how he looked at the world. "I see a drawer front," he said, "or 2 of them if I rip it down the middle. Quarter sawn grain right there. You see how the lines run straight across instead of in arcs. That means it won't move much with the seasons. That means it'll stay flat. You don't find that in a home center. You find it when you know what you're looking for." Wes didn't say anything, but he took the board back when his grandfather handed it to him, and he looked at it differently than he had before. Not with interest, not yet, but with the slightly unsettled expression of someone who has been told that the thing they had dismissed actually has a name, and the name means something. He put it back in the stack and went inside for supper. Silas stayed at the fence for another hour. The year 2005 was when the factory expanded. A new production wing went up over the summer, doubling the square footage of the CNC floor and adding 2 more saws. The off-cut loads roughly doubled with it. By the end of that year, Silas's records showed an accumulated inventory approaching 12,000 board feet. the equivalent of what a small retail lumber operation might move in a good quarter. He had been using the wood steadily cold frames for his late wife Margaret's vegetable garden, built from cedar scraps the first winter after she passed. Repairs on a neighbor's porch steps done quietly and without charge. A workbench for his own shop laminated from 3 layers of hard maple, as close to indestructible as wood can be. He was not accumulating for the sake of accumulating. He was using what he had, and the supply was outrunning the use. He needed more space. The old seasoning shed at the back of the property, a 12 by 20 structure Thomas had built in 1968 for conditioning. His personal walnut and cherry stock had been slowly losing its battle with time. The sill plates were soft, the roof sheathing had been repaired twice, and wouldn't survive another wet winter. Silas sat at his kitchen table for 3 evenings in March of 2005, with graph paper and a pencil and his reading glasses, and he drew up plans for a new one. He was systematic about it. He calculated the load requirements for the rafters, figured the spacing for the studs, drew the gambrel roof profile that would maximize storage in the loft while shedding snow cleanly. He worked the math twice. The structure would be 12 feet by 24 feet. The foundation would be concrete blocks. He had a stack of them salvaged from a demolition job years earlier. The framing lumber would be 2 by 6 Douglas fir from the fence stacks. The sheathing would be 3/4-inch plywood scraps, cut and fitted like a puzzle. The roof trusses he would build on the shop floor by hand from the same engineering principles the factory next door used in its automated systems, except his would be made with a handsaw and a framing square, and the knowledge that came from 40 years of understanding how wood behaves under load. It took him the entire summer. West, home from his junior year of high school, helped on weekends with the labor that required 2 pairs of hands raising the wall frames, setting the ridge beam, nailing the roof sheathing. He was 16 now and had his learner's permit and his mother's practicality. One Saturday afternoon, sweating on the roof with a framing nailer, he looked down at the rows of stickered lumber below them. "Grandpa, why don't you just buy the wood? It'd be so much faster." Silas was at the other end of the ridge, fitting a rafter tail. He didn't look up. "Faster isn't the point." "Then what's the point?" Silas set the rafter, checked its plumb, and drove 2 nails. "Better is the point." West didn't respond. He nailed 3 more sheets of sheathing before he went home for dinner. The shed was finished in September. From the road, it was modest, unremarkable, a gambrel-roofed outbuilding in weathered gray board, the kind of structure that could have been standing for 50 years without attracting attention. Inside, it was something else. The joints were tight. The floor was swept concrete. The gambrel loft held nearly as much volume as the main floor. The whole structure smelled of pine and faintly of the linseed oil Silas had wiped onto the exposed framing. He moved his personal walnut and cherry stock into it first. Then he began moving the best of the stickered stacks, the oldest, most fully seasoned material from the fence, now 3 and 4 years into its rest, stable and ready and waiting for purpose. The pile at the fence was not smaller. It was never smaller. But now it had a destination. The river of material from the factory next door had its diversion channel and its reservoir. And Silas Crenshaw, at 65 years old, understood, not with excitement, not with urgency, but with the calm certainty of a man reading a grain pattern, that what he was building was larger than a shed. He picked up the Stanley Bailey jointer plane from the workbench. His grandfather had bought it secondhand in 1931, a number 7 model with a cast iron body and a rosewood tote that had darkened to almost black over 80 years of handling. It was 17 inches long and weighed nearly 7 pounds, a serious tool designed not for shaping, but for truing, for taking a surface that was almost flat and making it exactly flat. You ran it with the grain long strokes, and when it was set right, the shavings came up in continuous ribbons, and the sound it made was a clean, consistent whisper that you could hear change slightly the moment the surface became true. Silas ran the plane over a piece of maple until the whisper settled into silence. Then he set it down carefully on its side, the way you always set a plane, never on its sole, never letting the blade touch the bench, and went to the window to look at the fence. The loads were still coming. The wood was still accumulating. The notebook was nearly full. He would need a new one. He thought about his grandfather Ezra, standing in the wreckage of the old Whitmore mill, after the flood of 1916, pulling good lumber from the mud with bare hands, because he could see what it still was rather than what it had become. He thought about Thomas in the same shop in 1974, sorting through a pile of construction scraps that a contractor had left at the end of the drive, refusing to let anything leave that still had a use in it. Waste is just a failure of imagination. Ezra had said it first as far as anyone knew. Thomas had said it to Silas. Silas had said it to West twice, and West had not yet understood it, which was fine. Understanding came when it came. You couldn't rush it. That was the nature of the thing. He opened the notebook to a fresh page and picked up his pencil. By his calculations, he would need a second structure within 3 years. Something larger, something with room for more than storage. He wrote the first dimensions at the top of the page slowly in his careful architectural hand. 30 feet by 50 feet. He paused, added a note in the margin electricity. Outside across the fence, the night shift was starting. He could hear the low hum of the CNC floor, the intermittent sound of the forklift moving through the production hall. Somewhere in that building, wood was being cut to the precise measurements that a customer in Cleveland or Charlotte had specified, and the remainders, the 12-inch end cuts, the angled offcuts, the plywood corners were accumulating in the steel bin that in another day or two would come rumbling to the back fence. Silas put the pencil down. He picked up the Stanley Bailey and ran his thumb carefully across the blade. Sharp enough. He turned off the shop light and walked to the house. Behind him in the dark, 12,000 board feet of prime lumber breathed quietly in stickered rows, settling, waiting, becoming more itself with every passing season. The second structure took 2 years. Silas broke ground on it in the spring of 2008, and what he was building was not a shed. The footprint alone, 30 by 50 feet, laid out with batter boards and string lines on a cold March morning, told you that. He poured the concrete piers himself 4 inches above grade to keep the sill plates dry, spacing them on a 16-inch module so the floor framing would carry the weight of what he intended to put inside. He did the calculations on a yellow legal pad, checked them twice, and did them a third time because the structure would have to hold machinery, and machinery is unforgiving of errors in arithmetic. June drove down from Charlotte in April and stood at the edge of the staked-out foundation looking at the string lines. It's bigger than our house. It needs to be. She waited for more. He did not offer more. She drove back to Charlotte that evening with the particular silence of someone who has stopped arguing, not because the argument is over, but because she has run out of things to say that haven't already failed to land. West was 19 that spring, finishing his first year at a community college in Raleigh, studying business administration. He came home for a weekend in May and stood where his mother had stood looking at the same string lines. What are you going to do with a barn? Work. You already have a workshop. Silas was crouching at a corner pier checking the level of a form with a small torpedo level. The bubble settled into center. He stood slowly. The knees were not what they had been, not since the winter of 2006 when he had slipped on ice at the fence line and landed badly. Nothing broken, but something shifted in both joints that had never quite shifted back. The workshop is for finishing. This is for everything else. West looked at the string lines one more time. He looked at the first shed, now visible through the gap in the dogwoods, neat and weathered, its gambrel roof a clean line against the sky. He looked at the ridge of material still accumulating at the fence line, lower now than it had been at its peak, because the first shed had given the good wood somewhere to go, but still substantial, still ongoing, still the source of a low-grade ache. Every time he imagined what his friends would think if they drove by, he went inside and watched television. The framing went up in July. 6x6 posts for the main frame hewn from the heaviest fir beams that had accumulated over 7 years, pieces too large for most furniture applications, but perfect for structural use, straight-grained and dry and dense from their years of patient seasoning. Silas notched the post bases himself, cutting the bird's mouth joints with a handsaw and a sharp chisel fitting each connection until it seated without daylight. He had to buy the metal roofing. That was the only thing. Every piece of wood in the structure, every post, every rafter, every piece of wall sheathing, every 1x8 board he used for the board and batten siding came from the fence stacks. The building took shape through the summer and fall. A large open central bay high enough to move machinery through. 2 side wings lower ceilinged for organized storage. Silas ran the electrical conduit himself in October, laying out the circuit locations with the same systematic attention he brought to everything: 2 20-amp circuits for future machinery, a separate circuit for lighting a small panel box set into the west wall at shoulder height. He pulled the permit. He had the inspection. The inspector, a man in his 50s named Dale Atchison, who had grown up in Weaverville and recognized the Stanley Bailey No. 7 hanging on its hook near the workbench, spent most of the inspection looking at the stickered wood stacks in the side wings. "That's a serious inventory," he said. "It's getting there. What are you planning to do with it?" Silas looked at the stacks for a moment. "What it's for?" Dale Atchison signed the inspection sheet. He paused at the door on his way out. My brother-in-law runs a custom shop over in Black Mountain. Been looking for clear fur for 3 years. Can't find it anymore. Not in these lengths. Silas did not say anything. He filed the inspection certificate in the folder where he kept the property documents and went back to work. He thought about what Dale Atchison had said for a week before he wrote anything down. Then he opened a fresh page in the new notebook, the third one now, its predecessors full of board footage, tallies, and species notes, and wrote a single line at the top. What is it for? He thought about his grandfather Ezra's hands pulling lumber from the flood wreckage of the Whitmore mill, because he could see what it was rather than what it had become. He thought about his father Thomas, who had spent a career making furniture from materials that other people had already dismissed, and whose work a sideboard, a corner cabinet, a set of dining chairs still stood in houses across Buncombe County, still solid, still square, still doing what furniture is supposed to do. The wood in these stacks was better than anything you could walk into a store and buy. That was the plain fact of it. The factory next door was using prime stock, first-grade, kiln-dried, no box store filler, and the offcuts were the same material. 12 years of patient accumulation, sorted and seasoned and stickered, had produced something that most custom woodworkers would have paid serious money for. And he had the machines to work it. Not yet, but he would. He began buying them quietly in the winter of 2009. The way he did everything, without announcement, without asking permission, without explaining himself, until the explanation was no longer necessary, because the thing had already become real. The table saw came first. A 1953 Delta Unisaw 3-phase motor 10-inch blade, the kind of machine that the factories of the 1950s had built to last, without assuming anyone would ever need to replace them. He found it at an estate auction outside Hendersonville, the contents of a small mill workshop, whose owner had died the previous spring, without heirs, interested in continuing the business. The saw had not been run in 8 years. It needed a new arbor bearing a replacement switch and a full tune-up of the fence and miter gauge. Silas paid $340 for it and brought it home on a borrowed trailer, the cast iron table wrapped in moving blankets. He spent 3 weekends restoring it. The bearing he ordered from a machinist's supply house in Charlotte. The switch he sourced from an electrical supplier in Asheville. He lapped the cast iron table flat on a surface plate with abrasive compound working in figure-8 patterns until the reflection of the shop light showed no distortion. When he was done, the fence ran true within 1/1000th of an inch over its full length, and the blade rose and tilted without a trace of play. He moved it into the new barn and bolted it to the concrete floor. The joiner came next. A 24-inch Northfield built in the 1940s, purchased from the shop teacher at a high school in Waynesville that was closing its vocational program to make room for more computer labs. The teacher, a man named Gerald Poe, who had run the program for 22 years, helped Silas load it onto the trailer and stood in the parking lot watching it go, with an expression that Silas recognized the look of someone watching a tool leave a place where it had been understood. You going to use it? Gerald Poe asked. That's the idea. Good, he paused. A lot of people buy old machines and just collect them. I know. Silas got into his truck. I'm not collecting. He paid $500 for the joiner and spent a month rebuilding the outfeed table, lapping the cast iron beds flat, replacing the V-belts and the knife-setting jigs. When it was running correctly, it could take a rough board and produce a face so flat and smooth you could use it as a reference surface for further layout. It was the kind of capacity that changed what you could make. By the spring of 2010, the barn had the table saw the joiner a 14-inch bandsaw from an Asheville cabinet shop that was upgrading to CNC equipment, a heavy drill press, and a dust collection system cobbled together from 2 older units whose impellers he had rebuilt. Total spent just under $2,000 for equipment that would have cost close to $40,000 new. West came home that Easter and walked through the barn without saying anything for a long time. Where did all this come from? Auctions, estate sales, a school closing? West looked at the table saw. He ran a hand along the cast iron fence rail. Does it work? Want to find out? Silas cut a piece of Douglas fir into 4 equal strips, ripped clean and true, the sawdust rising in a fine golden cloud. West held one of the strips, feeling its faces squinting down its length. That's really straight. Yes. West set it down. He looked at the stacks of lumber in the side wings, the accumulation of nearly a decade sorted and tagged and waiting. He did the mental arithmetic the way his business courses had trained him to do, it multiplying estimated board footage by current market price, arriving at a number that surprised him. He did not say the number out loud. He went back to the main house and called his mother. "Mom, have you seen the barn?" The spring of 2011 was the last ordinary season. The deliveries continued through March and April. Silas worked the fence line in the evenings, stickering, sorting, making notes. His hands had begun to ache in the cold mornings, a deep joint ache that he recognized as the early work of arthritis, showing up in his 60s the way it had shown up in his father's 60s and his grandfather's before that. He adjusted his grip on the plane. He adjusted the angle of his wrist. He did not stop. In May, he began restoring the Stanley Bailey in earnest, not because it needed restoration exactly, but because he had been using it for 40 years, and using a tool for 40 years means it eventually wants your full attention. He disassembled it completely, soaking the japanned castings in penetrating oil to free the old paint, lapping the sole flat on the surface plate, reseating the chip breaker, honing the blade on a series of waterstones until the edge could shave the hair on his forearm cleanly and without pressure. He reassembled it, ran it across a piece of maple. The shaving came up in a single unbroken ribbon, thin as a page. He set it on its side on the bench and looked at it for a moment. His grandfather had bought this plane secondhand, used it for 30 years, passed it to Thomas, who used it for 30 more. It had been in continuous use for nearly a century. The rosewood handle had been touched by 3 generations of Crenshaw hands, and the patina was not the artificial warmth of furniture wax, but the genuine dark of oil and time built up so slowly over so many years that it had become part of the material. He thought about what he was building in the barn. He thought about West and Raleigh in his business courses, learning to think in spreadsheets. He thought, not yet. There was more to do before the thing was ready to be explained. Some things you have to build before you can describe them, because the description without the thing means nothing, but the thing without the description speaks for itself. Then came the summer of 2011 and the new ownership and Reed Calloway. The acquisition closed in June. Silas noticed the changes at the factory before he knew the reason for them: different trucks in the parking lot, unfamiliar faces on the loading dock, the forklift running a slightly different pattern in the afternoons. He noticed but did not yet investigate because nothing had changed at the fence, and the fence was what mattered. Reed Calloway was 36 years old. Duke MBA, Lean Six Sigma black belt, which was a credential from the manufacturing world that meant he had been formally trained in the science of eliminating waste, a discipline that, in its industrial application, produced extraordinary efficiencies, and in its human application occasionally produced a man who could not walk through a room without mentally calculating what should be removed from it. He had grown up in Hickory, North Carolina, 40 miles east, in a house that had been the opposite of ordered. His father, a man who worked hard and drank harder, had collected things the way some people collect debts, without intention, without system, without any apparent sense of the difference between what was useful and what was simply present. The garage, the back porch, the shed behind the house, all of it layered and dense and unmovable, a physical record of a mind that could not distinguish keeping from hoarding, use from accumulation. Reed Calloway had spent his adolescence navigating that house and his adulthood escaping it. His professional identity was built in ways he probably could not have fully articulated on the proposition that mess was a moral failure, and that clarity, the clarity of a clean floor plan, an auditable process, a documented procedure, was the opposite of everything he had grown up in. He was not a bad man. He was a man with a wound that had calcified into a worldview. He walked the factory floor on his 3rd day with a tablet and a stopwatch. He walked it again on his 4th. On his 5th, he saw the forklift operator take the off-cut bin, not to the main dumpster near the front of the building, but to the back fence where the bin was hoisted and tipped, and a cascade of clean lumber fell onto the Crenshaw property. "What is that?" he asked the shift foreman, a man named Curtis, who had replaced Harlan Briggs when Briggs retired the previous year. Curtis shrugged. "Deal we have with the old guy next door. We dump the scraps, he handles the cleanup. Been going on since before my time." Reed looked at the fence. He looked at what was visible of the Crenshaw property, the ridge of material along the fence line, the roof of the gambrel shed, the larger barn structure behind it. Who authorized it? Curtis thought about this. I don't think anyone authorized it exactly. It was just is it in writing? No. Is there a contract? No. Is there an insurance rider covering liability for injuries on adjacent property? Curtis looked at him. No, Reed said. He made a note on his tablet. I'll handle it. He came on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. Silas was at the workbench sharpening the Stanley Bailey's blade on the fine waterstone, the steel moving in smooth figure-8 patterns, the sound a soft, wet whisper. He was wearing his shop apron and his reading glasses. He did not look up when the knock came on the doorframe. He finished the figure eight. He lifted the blade and checked the edge in the light. Not sharp enough, not yet. He set it back on the stone. Mr. Crenshaw. Silas looked up. A man in a blue button-down shirt and what appeared to be new work boots stood in the doorway. The boots were clean, not just clean, unworn. The leather had not yet taken the shape of the foot inside it. Yes, Reed Calloway, operations at Ridgeline. He gestured toward the factory. I've been reviewing our disposal procedures. I wanted to talk to you about the arrangement concerning our wood offcuts. Silas set the blade down. He picked up a clean rag and wiped his hands, though they didn't need wiping. He waited. Calloway explained the situation efficiently. The informal arrangement was undocumented, uninsured, and inconsistent with the company's operational standards. He was not there to make trouble. He was there to offer a solution. The company was prepared to formalize the relationship, a lease agreement, $100 per month, allowing the use of the back corner of the Crenshaw property as a designated material staging area. Clean, legal, auditable. The old man would receive a monthly check for doing nothing. He smiled when he finished. It was a professional smile, the kind that communicates confidence in the reasonableness of what has just been said. Silas looked at him for a moment. The wood isn't debris, he said. It's lumber. The smile tightened. Calloway explained patiently that from a balance sheet perspective, the material was classified as process waste. The company paid to dispose of it. He was offering the adjacent landowner a revenue stream for essentially nothing. No, Silas said. The single syllable appeared to genuinely surprise Calloway, not because he was unaccustomed to negotiation, but because this was not a counteroffer. It was a wall. He tried a different angle. Either they signed an agreement or he terminated the deliveries in 30 days. He would contract with the disposal company for a dedicated roll-off on the factory lot. $1,500 a month, but clean and auditable. And the existing accumulated material on the Crenshaw property, he had pulled the county ordinances. It appeared to be in violation of Section 114B, uncontrolled accumulation of solid waste. If it wasn't remediated by October 31st, he would be obligated to notify code enforcement. He was not, he emphasized, trying to be difficult. He was operating within the parameters of his professional responsibilities. Silas picked up the Stanley Bailey, not the blade, the assembled plane. He turned it in his hands, once feeling the weight of it, the cast iron and the rosewood, and the nearly century of use that had made the handle as smooth as riverstone. You do what you have to do, he said. What happened next was not what Reed Calloway expected, and not what June feared, and not what Wes, calling from Raleigh with his second-hand urgency, had prepared any remarks for. What happened was nothing, or rather, nothing visible. Calloway sent his letter. Silas received it. And then 2 years passed in which the fence line continued to receive its loads, the stacks continued to season, and Silas Crenshaw continued to acquire and restore the machinery that was accumulating in the barn with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything else. Calloway, it turned out, had issued a deadline, but lacked the appetite for the follow-through. The code enforcement officer drove by the property twice and did not stop. The loads continued. The clock he had started was running, but no one at Ridgeline was watching it. No one, that is, except Silas, who was watching it the way a craftsman watches wood in a clamp, not with anxiety, but with the calm attention of someone who knows that time given enough of it does the work for you. Calloway sent the certified letter the next morning. It arrived on a Thursday. June called that evening. She had seen it. Silas had left it on the kitchen counter open, which was as close as he came to asking for a conversation. Dad, he has a point about the ordinance. He has a point about several things. Then why didn't you take the deal, $100 a month? He was offering to pay me to store his trash. I'm not a junkyard. But it's not trash. You've been saying that for 12 years, which is exactly why. The wood has a purpose, June. It's not finished yet. The pause on the line had a specific quality, not the silence of someone thinking, but the silence of someone choosing not to say the thing they are thinking. Wes thinks you should call a lawyer. Wes thinks a lot of things. Dad, I'll handle it. He hung up. He sat for a while at the kitchen table. The certified letter was in front of him. He read it once more, the legal language, the date, the signature, and set it down. Then he walked out to the barn. He turned on the lights. The barn's high windows let in the last of the evening's pale light, and the overhead fluorescence filled in the rest, and the space that opened before him, the cast iron machines on their concrete footings, the clean swept floor, the side wings with their orderly stacks of seasoned lumber, was nothing like what the letter described. The letter described a safety hazard, an uncontrolled accumulation, a violation. What Silas saw was a workshop waiting to begin. He walked to the side wing and pulled a board from the Douglas fir stack. Clear-grained reddish-brown, its surface still carrying the faint texture of the original mill saw, waiting for the jointer and the planer to bring it to final dimension. He held it up to the light the way he always did, sighting down the face, reading what the grain was telling him. No twist, no cup. 10 years of stickered seasoning had done what kiln drying alone never could. He set it back in the stack. He had 30 days. The deadline was not a threat. It was a clock, and clocks had never frightened him. Only people who hadn't done the work they needed to do were frightened by clocks. He had done the work. What remained was the final stage of it. He pulled the Stanley Bailey from his apron pocket. He had been carrying it back and forth from the shop for 3 days, finishing the honing in small increments, and ran his thumb along the blade. There it was, that clean, almost yielding sharpness that the edge only reaches after the finest stone, after the leather strop, after the kind of patience that can't be hurried. He put the plane back in his pocket. He walked the length of the barn, touching each stack of lumber as he passed it. The maple, the oak, the pine, the fir. Each species with its own character under his hand, and he made a list in his head of what needed to happen in the next 30 days and in what order. It was a long list. He was not worried. Wes found out from his mother, who called him on a Sunday in August. He drove down from Raleigh the following weekend, arriving at noon with the low-grade urgency of someone who expects to find evidence of a crisis and has already rehearsed the words for managing it. He found his grandfather in the barn directing a young man named Cody from down the road, 19 years old, strong, working for $15 an hour, in the careful transfer of stickered lumber from the fence line stacks into the barn's side wings. They were not using a chipper. They were using wheelbarrows, moving one stack at a time, maintaining the organization that had been established over years. Wes stood in the barn doorway and watched for several minutes before Silas noticed him. "You drove 3 hours," Silas said, "not a question. Mom said you got a legal letter." "I did. And you're just moving wood." "That's right." Wes looked at the progress. Half the side wings filled the lumber from outside, coming in steadily, the methodical rhythm of Cody's wheelbarrow runs. He looked at the machines. He looked at the board on the east wall of the barn, where Silas had pinned a rough floor plan showing the placement of each piece of equipment, each storage section, each clear aisle. It was a production layout. It was the plan for a working mill. "Grandpa," Wes said slowly, "but what is this?" Silas was directing Cody to a specific section of shelving. He turned to look at his grandson. "What does it look like?" Wes took another step into the barn. He walked to the nearest lumber stack and read the tag at the end, Douglas fir. 2x8, 220 board feet. Stickered April 2007. He moved to the next stack. Hard maple, 4/4, 180 board feet. Stickered November 2005. He walked the length of the side wing reading tags. His business school training was processing the numbers without his full permission. 12 years of accumulated inventory. Market value of clear seasoned hardwood. The machinery on the floor. The electrical panel. The floor plan on the board. He stopped in front of the large piece of Douglas fir that Silas had set aside on a pair of sawhorses near the workbench, a clear, wide board 30 inches across 6 feet long quarter. Sawn, the medullary rays showing as a faint silk shimmer across the face. He had never seen a board that wide outside of an antique. Where did this come from? Same place as the rest. From next door, they were throwing this away. They didn't know what it was. Wes looked at the board for a long time. He touched its face with the flat of his hand. Something shifted in his expression, not sudden, not dramatic, but real. The particular realignment that happens when a thing you have understood one way for a long time reveals itself to be something else entirely. "You've been planning this the whole time," he said. Silas did not answer. He picked up the Stanley Bailey from the bench, turned it over once in his hands, set it back down. Outside, through the open barn doors, the late summer light was falling across the fence line. The stacks outside were diminishing. Inside, the inventory was growing, not in chaos, not in disorder, but in the careful, considered arrangement of a man who has known all along what he was building toward and has simply been waiting for the moment when all the pieces were in place. The clatter of the wheelbarrow on the concrete, the soft creak of the barn's frame settling in the afternoon heat. Somewhere across the fence, the low hum of the CNC floor running the evening shift. Wes sat down on a sawhorse. He looked at the floor plan on the wall. He looked at his grandfather's hands. He did not go back to Raleigh that Sunday. He called his supervisor on Monday morning and asked for a week of leave. He told his mother that night. She did not say anything for a long time. "He's got you," she said finally. "I don't think he was trying to," Wes said. "I think I just finally looked." On the morning of October 31st, Reed Calloway stood at his office window and looked at the Crenshaw property. The fence line was clear. The ridge of material that had defined the property's western border for 12 years was gone. In its place, bare ground, a strip of pale dirt where the lumber stacks had stood still, showing the marks of the foundation timbers. He felt something unclench in his chest. He had not wanted the confrontation. He had not wanted to be the person who filed the code enforcement complaint. The old man had surprised him by complying by removing the material without legal pressure, without a fight. He made a note in his calendar, November 1st, Hemlock follow-up canceled. He crossed it out. He went back to the production schedule. What he did not know, what he could not see from his window, was what the inside of the Crenshaw barn contained. He had watched the fence line. He had not watched the barn. He had seen the pile disappear and concluded that the material had been cleared. He had not understood that disappearing and clearing were two different things. The material had not been cleared. It had been moved. Every board, every beam, every stickered stack, 12 years of accumulation, now fully seasoned, fully organized, and newly housed behind the closed doors of a 30 by 50-foot structure whose electrical system had been inspected and certified, and whose floor had been swept clean, and whose machinery was tuned and ready. Silas Crenshaw spent the evening of October 31st in the barn. He hung a new sign above the workbench, the sign he had made the previous week from a single wide piece of Douglas fir, the letters carved cleanly in a font his grandfather had used for shop signs, deep enough to hold paint without bleeding Crenshaw and Kin custom millwork. He looked at it for a while. The letters were even. The grain of the fir ran straight behind them, the reddish wood warm in the barn's yellow light. He picked up the Stanley Bailey. He set it against a piece of maple on the bench. He ran it the length of the board, one long stroke, the shaving rising in a clean ribbon curling at the end and falling to the floor. The sound of it in the quiet of the barn was the sound of a thing beginning. He set the plane down on its side. He turned off the lights. Tomorrow morning, a cream-colored envelope would go into his truck. And at 9 o'clock, Silas Crenshaw, 61 years old when this started, 73 years old now with arthritic hands and a bad knee, and 12 years of patience behind him, would walk into the Ridgeline offices and hand it to the man who had told him to clean up his mess. The mess, it turned out, was a mill. And the mill was open for business. The envelope sat on the passenger seat of the truck, cream-colored and square, the address written in Silas's architectural hand. He drove the quarter-mile to the factory entrance, the long way out to the county road, left again into the industrial park, because the direct route through the back gate was the forklift route, and this was not that kind of visit. He parked in the visitor lot. He sat for a moment with the engine off. The morning was cold and clear, the 1st of November, the Blue Ridge visible to the west, in the particular sharp blue that only comes after the leaves have gone and the air has no humidity left in it. He could see the ridge from the parking lot. He had looked at that ridge his entire life and never once thought of it as beautiful the way you stop seeing beautiful things that have always been there. This morning he noticed it. He picked up the envelope. He got out of the truck. The receptionist at the Ridgeline offices was a young woman who asked his name and called back to Reed Calloway's office and then looked up with the expression of someone relaying a message she did not entirely understand. "He says he'll be right out." Silas stood near the door. He did not sit in the waiting area chairs. He held the envelope at his side and looked at the framed photographs on the wall. The factory in various stages of construction, a ribbon-cutting ceremony, an aerial photograph of the completed facility that showed, if you knew where to look, the narrow strip of the Crenshaw property running along the western fence line. In the aerial photograph, the lumber stacks were visible, a long, pale ridge along the fence casting a slight shadow in the morning light of whatever summer the photograph had been taken. He was still looking at the photograph when Reed Calloway came through the interior door. Calloway stopped when he saw him. Something crossed his face, surprise, then a rapid recalibration. "Mr. Crenshaw, I believe this is in order," Silas said and held out the envelope. Calloway opened it at his desk, Silas standing on the other side of it. He read the single line item. He read the total. He looked up. "What is this?" "It's an invoice." The laugh came out sharp and short. The laugh of a man who has been handed something he has categorized instantly and with complete confidence as absurd. "This is a joke." "It isn't." Silas's voice was the same temperature it always was. "You stated that the wood cost your company $1,500 a month to dispose of. That's $18,000 a year. Over 12 years, that's $216,000. I prevented that cost. I received the material sorted, it stored it under conditions that preserved its value, and managed it for more than a decade. I'm billing you for less than 25 cents on every dollar I saved you. I think that's a conservative number. Calloway set the invoice on his desk. We had a verbal agreement. We let you take the wood for free. You are correct, Silas said. We had an agreement that I could use the wood. And I have. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small object, a key hand-carved from a piece of hard maple smooth, from handling the bow shaped into a simple arc. I'd like you to come and see how. The silence in the office had a specific quality. The silence of a man whose professional reflexes are telling him one thing and whose genuine curiosity is telling him something else. And the two of them are briefly equally loud. West was standing near the door. He had arrived at the factory 15 minutes earlier, having driven from the barn where he had spent the previous week working alongside his grandfather, moving wood and tuning machines and understanding in the accumulating way that understanding works. What 12 years of patience looked like when it was finally assembled in one place. He had not been invited to this meeting. He had come because the alternative was waiting at the barn, and he found he could not do that. He looked at his grandfather's face. He looked at the invoice on the desk. Calloway stood up. They walked in silence across the parking lot, through the gate in the chain-link fence, onto the Crenshaw property. Past the house with its porch and its woodpile stacked exact and cross-hatched. Past the old workshop, its door closed, the smell of linseed oil faint in the cold air. Past the first shed, gambrel-roofed and weathered, holding its shape after 8 years without complaint. To the barn. Silas stopped in front of the two large sliding doors. The sign above them was new carved Douglas fir, the letters deep and clean, Crenshaw and Kin Custom Millwork. The wood's reddish grains showed between the painted letters, warm even on a cold morning. He used the maple key on the side door. He swung it open and stepped back. Reed Calloway stepped through the door. He stopped. The light from the high clerestory windows fell in long, angled columns across the barn floor, each column full of the slow drift of fine sawdust that had been stirred up during the previous week's work and had not yet fully settled. In that light, the cast-iron machines stood like patient animals, the table saw on its concrete footing, the long bed of the joiner, the bandsaw's tall frame. The floor around them was swept. The electrical panel on the west wall was properly labeled in Silas's hand. The dust collection pipes ran overhead in painted galvanized steel, clean and ordered. And on either side, filling the side wings to the ceiling, joists were the stacks. 12 years of Douglas fir and hard maple and white oak and southern pine, sorted by species and dimension and date, each stack tagged in the same architectural hand, each one stickered with the same uniform spacing, each one straight and dry and stable. The accumulated cast-off material of a factory that had processed millions of board feet of prime lumber and called its remainders waste. It was not waste. It was by any professional measure one of the finest private lumber inventories in western North Carolina. The fir alone, clear-grained, quarter-sawn, in places fully seasoned, would have been difficult to source commercially at any price. The wide maple boards in the far corner of the south wing had not been available from standard retail suppliers for 20 years. Calloway stood in the center of the barn for a long time without speaking. West stood near the door watching him. He had watched his grandfather's face for the past week and seen something he could not fully name, a quality of settled certainty, the expression of a man who has been waiting a very long time for a moment that he was never entirely sure would come, and who, now that it has come, finds that it is exactly what he expected. Not triumph, not vindication, just yes. This is what it was for. Calloway picked up the invoice from where he had carried it folded once in his breast pocket. He looked at it. He looked at the lumber stacks. He did the arithmetic. The legal fight would be a nightmare. The public story, a corporation pursuing a 73-year-old craftsman for the crime of cleaning up their waste, was a story that wrote itself, and it did not write itself in Ridgeline's favor. He had walked onto this property 45 minutes ago with every structural advantage, corporate backing, legal resources, regulatory leverage. He was standing in the middle of an argument he had already lost, built from his own company's discarded material, organized according to a logic he could not fault, priced at less than a quarter of what it had saved. He looked at the Stanley Bailey sitting on the workbench. He looked at the sign above the door. He looked at his own hands for a moment. The clean hands, the uncalloused hands, the hands that had never worked wood. And then he looked at Silas Crenshaw's hands, resting at his side, scarred and darkened and completely still. "I'll need to talk to our legal team," he said. "That's fine," Silas said. I've waited 12 years. I can wait a few more weeks. The lawyers came and went. There were meetings at a conference table in the Ridgeline offices, Silas and West on one side, two attorneys and Reed Calloway on the other. Silas brought nothing to these meetings, no documents, no counter-proposals, no prepared arguments. He sat with his calloused hands resting on the polished table and answered questions when they were asked and waited when they were not. West in those meetings began to understand something about negotiation that his business courses had not taught him, that the person with the most patience is rarely the person with the most lawyers. The settlement came on a Thursday morning in late November, 3 weeks after the invoice had been delivered. Ridgeline paid $18,000, not the full amount, but a number that both sides could document as reasonable within the framework of their respective positions. More importantly, they signed a contract, 10 years renewable. All production offcuts from the Ridgeline facility to be sold to Crenshaw and Kin Custom Millwork at 10 cents on the dollar of the original material cost. The factory converted a disposal liability into a revenue line. Calloway framed it in his quarterly report as an innovative waste reduction partnership. The language was careful and accurate and told almost none of the story. What the contract meant in practical terms was this: the river that had been flowing for 12 years would keep flowing. And now it had a proper channel and a proper price and a name on a piece of paper. Silas signed the contract with a pen his father had given him, a plain ballpoint. Nothing special, which was the kind of pen you use when you want the words to matter more than the instrument. He drove home. He went to the barn. He ran a board through the table saw for the first time in a working capacity. Not a test cut, not a calibration, but a real cut, the first piece of material being processed toward an actual purpose. A client in Black Mountain, referred by Dale Atchison's brother-in-law, had ordered a set of kitchen cabinet doors in Douglas fir. Clear, vertical grain raised panel, traditional profile. The kind of work that required exactly the material Silas had been accumulating and exactly the patience he had been practicing. He ripped the board to rough width. He ran it over the joiner. He listened to the machine take the mill surface off and leave behind the clean, flat face that was the starting point for everything else. The shop filled with the smell of fresh-cut fir, a smell that is partly pine and partly something else, something older and greener. A smell that does not translate into words because it exists below the level where language operates. Wes stood at the end of the joiner, receiving the board as it came through, supporting its weight, learning the feel of it. June drove down from Charlotte that weekend. She parked in the drive and walked to the barn and stood in the doorway for a long time without going in. She watched her father at the workbench, fitting a frame joint, his reading glasses on the Stanley Bailey sitting at his right hand, where it always sat when he was working at the bench. She watched her son at the table saw, measuring a board with a combination square, marking the cut line in pencil, checking the measurement again before committing to the cut. The two of them had not spoken to each other about what was happening. They did not need to. The work was the conversation. The work had always been the conversation in this family, and June had always known that and had sometimes resented it, and was finding this morning that her resentment had lost some of its edge. She went inside and sat at her father's kitchen table and made coffee. When Silas came in for lunch, she was sitting there with both hands around the mug, looking out the window at the barn. "You knew," she said, "the whole time." Silas sat down across from her. He did not answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. "I knew what the wood was," he said finally. "The rest I hoped. You could have just told me. Would you have believed it?" She looked at her coffee. The truth of this settled between them without needing to be confirmed. "West isn't going back to Raleigh." "I know. Is that what you wanted?" Silas looked out the window at the barn, at the sign above the door visible from the kitchen window. If you knew where to look, the carved fir letters, the reddish grain between them. "I wanted the work to continue," he said. "I hoped West would want to be part of it. Those aren't the same thing." June was quiet for a moment. "Then he called me last night. He said you'd been teaching him to sharpen the plane. He's getting it. He said it took him 4 hours to get an edge you could use. That's about right for the first time." June looked at the window. She looked at her father's hands around his coffee mug. The knuckles thickened the scar on the left index finger, white and permanent. The skin darkened in the creases from 40 years of wood oils and finishes. "I'm sorry I called it a junk heap," she said. Silas looked at her. His expression did not change, but something in it softened slightly, the way a board relaxes after you've planed the tension out of it. "You called it what it looked like," he said. "That's fair. Things take time to become what they are." 7 years passed, the way years pass when the work is good, not slowly and not quickly, but in the rhythm of the seasons and the projects, and the accumulating knowledge that comes from doing a thing well over a long period of time. Wes did not go back to Raleigh. He stayed first for a week, then for a month, then through the winter, then until spring. And by the time spring came, he had stopped counting because counting had stopped making sense. He learned to read the grain of a board, the way the lines told you which direction to plane, which cuts would produce long, clean chips, and which would tear. He learned to tune the machines, the precise geometry of the joiner's outfeed table, the relationship between blade height and fence angle on the table, saw the way the bandsaw's blade tension changed with temperature and needed checking on cold mornings. He learned to sharpen, which took longer than anything else, the patient work of the stones, the figure-8 patterns, the moment when the edge went from sharp to the other thing, the thing that had no name, but that you recognized by the way the wood responded to it. He learned the difference between price and value, which his grandfather had been telling him for years in various ways, and which he finally understood not through an explanation, but through the experience of holding a piece of quarter-sawn white oak that had been seasoning for 11 years and feeling in his hands why it was worth more than the number on any invoice. Crenshaw and Kin grew carefully the way Silas grew everything without urgency, without overreach. They took on a third employee in the second year, a young woman named Patrice, who had trained at a furniture school in Vermont and moved to Asheville for the mountains and found her way to the barn through a classified ad Silas had posted on a corkboard at the lumberyard. They added a fourth in the fourth year. The work they produced custom cabinetry, architectural millwork, the occasional piece of furniture that clients waited 18 months for because the material needed to be right, circulated quietly through Asheville and into Buncombe County, and eventually beyond it, the way quality work circulates through the people who have it, showing it to the people who want it. The Ridgeline contract renewed at the end of its first 10-year term. The new operations manager, Reed Calloway, had moved on after 3 years to a larger facility in Charlotte, taking his optimization expertise and his clean work boots with him, signed the renewal without the history that had produced it, regarding it simply as a sensible arrangement that had been in place for a decade and showed no reason to change. Which from a certain angle was exactly what it was. Silas Crenshaw died on a Tuesday morning in March, in his sleep, in the house his grandfather had built from salvaged mill lumber in 1924. He was 80 years old. He had been in the barn the previous afternoon finishing the fitting of a set of drawer boxes for a client in Waynesville, and he had come in for supper and read for an hour and gone to bed. Wes found him in the morning. He sat in the kitchen for a long time before he called anyone. He made coffee. He looked out the window at the barn. He thought about 12 years of watching the fence from a distance, embarrassed by what was accumulating there, and about the morning he had walked into the barn and understood for the first time what it was. He thought about the invoice on the wall of the office framed now behind glass. The dot matrix printing, faded slightly, but legible storage sorting and curation of raw materials. He thought about the Stanley Bailey on its hook beside the workbench, where it had hung every evening at the end of the workday for as long as Wes could remember. He called June. He called the others. He did what needed to be done. What West inherited was the house, the 4.1 acres, and the business. What he inherited that was not on any legal document was the way of seeing that made the business possible. The ability to look at a piece of wood and understand what it still was, rather than what it had been discarded as. The ability to wait. The ability to do the work without needing anyone to understand why, until the work itself made the explanation unnecessary. These were not strictly speaking things you could inherit. They were things you had to learn. But learning them in the presence of someone who lived them day after day for the better part of a decade, that was a kind of inheritance, the most durable kind. On an evening in October, 7 years after Silas died, and 26 years after the first load of Douglas fir came over the chain-link fence, Wes Crenshaw was alone in the barn. The barn smelled the way it always smelled, sawdust and linseed oil, and the faint green pine smell of fresh-cut fir, with underneath it the darker smell of the older wood, the oak and maple that had been seasoning so long. Their smell had deepened from sharp to something almost sweet, the smell of wood that has finally become fully itself. He was at the workbench working on a single board. Wide, hard maple, 28 inches across 6 feet long, the last board from a stack his grandfather had stickered in the fall of 2003. He had been saving it for something that would be worthy of it, and he had finally found the purpose, a dining table for his daughter who was 7 years old, and had recently begun coming to the barn on Saturday mornings and asking questions about what things were for. He was flattening the board with the Stanley Bailey. He had taken the plane from its hook that morning, the way he did every morning, the same hook, the same position, the side resting on the wood block his grandfather had screwed to the wall in 1987, so the sole would never rest against a hard surface. He had checked the blade. He had set the mouth, adjusting the frog with the small brass-tipped screw until the gap was exactly right for the cut he needed. He had stropped the edge on the leather that hung beside the hook. Now he ran the plane the length of the board. Long, even strokes, the weight of the cast-iron body doing most of the work, his hands guiding more than pushing. The shaving rose in a continuous ribbon, thin, translucent, the grain visible in it like a watermark, and curled away from the blade and settled on the bench beside the board. He stopped. He sighted down the surface of the board, closing one eye, reading the light across it, the way his grandfather had taught him, looking for the faint shadow that meant high spots remaining. There near the left edge, a slight rise. He set the plane to take a finer cut. 2 strokes across the high spot. He sighted again. Gone. He ran his hand across the surface. Flat. Smooth in the way that only comes from a sharp blade set right. Not the false smoothness of sandpaper which cuts the fibers, but the true smoothness of a plane which severs them cleanly and leaves them sealed. He set the Stanley Bailey down on its side. The rosewood handle was dark with a century of hands. He had re-honed the blade more times than he could count. The sole had been lapped flat twice since his grandfather had inherited it, once by Silas and once by West himself on a cold January morning, 2 years after Silas died, when he discovered it had developed a slight belly and spent 4 hours with the surface plate and the abrasive compound until it was true again. The plane was not the same plane it had been when Ezra Crenshaw bought it secondhand in 1931. Most of its original parts had been replaced or restored or refined at some point in its 90 years of use. But it was the same plane in the way that mattered, in the intention it carried, in the knowledge embedded in its adjustments, in the long continuity of hands that had held it, in work that had come from it. West looked at his daughter's table. The surface of the maple glowed in the barn's warm light, the grain rippling slightly, the medullary rays catching the angle and throwing back a faint silk shimmer, the color a deep cream that would deepen further with age and oil and use. His grandfather had stickered this board when West was 14 years old and not paying attention. It had waited 23 years to become what it was for. Through the barn's high windows, the October sky had gone the deep blue of early evening. The Blue Ridge was a dark line to the west, familiar and permanent. Somewhere in the barn's rafters, a late swallow was moving, disturbed by the shift in light. The machines stood in their places on the floor. The Delta table saw the Northfield jointer, the bandsaw, the drill press, solid and patient, waiting for morning. West ran his hand across the table surface one more time. He picked up a piece of chalk and marked the dimensions for the leg mortises in the corners. He did not think about what the maple had been before this. He did not think about what it had looked like coming over a chain-link fence on a Tuesday morning in 2003. He thought about the mortise angle and the leg taper and the drawbore peg he would use to pull the joint tight without glue. He thought about Saturday morning when his daughter would come to the barn and he would let her hold the plane. He thought about what he would say when she asked why the handle was so dark. He would tell her about Ezra, who pulled lumber from a flood because he could see what it still was. He would tell her about Thomas, who made furniture from things others had already dismissed. He would tell her about Silas, who spent 12 years sorting and stacking and waiting for a purpose to catch up to a material that was always better than anyone knew. He would tell her that the darkness in the handle is the record of all those hands, and that a tool that has been used well and cared for and passed down is not an old thing. It is a continuous thing. And you are not its inheritor, but its next user. And someday it will belong to someone who isn't born yet. And she would probably not understand all of it, not at 7. But she would hold the plane and she would feel its weight and she would remember the feeling. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. The barn settled into quiet. The swallow found its rafter. The October light went from blue to deep. Wes Crenshaw picked up the Stanley Bailey one more time, set it to the maple, and ran it home. Before you close your eyes tonight, think of something you've been tending quietly, something that looks like nothing from the outside, but that you know if you give it enough time will become what it was always meant to be. The world is full of people who can calculate the cost of things. What the world needs more of is people who can see the worth. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it. Subscribe so you don't miss them. Sleep well. End of script. Total words, 1400, parts 3, twists, 6 climaxes, 4, quote-worthy lines, 7. Motif Stanley Bailey plane, 11 appearances. Timeline 2001 to 2039. Internal setting. Asheville, North Carolina, USA.